Hello everybody. Welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be discussing the New Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 30th November 2019. Topics to be discussed are displayed on the screen and timestamping for the same are given in the description box below. So let's start. Now this article relates to a tussle between DRDO and Israeli firm Rafael Advanced Defense Systems over induction of anti-tank guided missile into the Indian Army and appears on page number 9 and becomes important from the perspective of prelims examination, where often there are questions that are asked on the names of the missiles, and also from the perspective of general studies paper 3 mains examination under security issues related to defense procurement. Now, there is an ongoing tussle between DRDO and Israeli firm Rafael Advanced Defense Systems over induction of anti-tank guided missiles into the Indian Army, in that the Israeli manufacturer has recently said that the anti-tank guided missile Spike is much better than the Nag missile systems, and India should revisit its anti-tank guided missile procurement policy. Now, in this context, it is important to note that in 2018, India cancelled the deal with Rafael Advanced Defense Systems in favor of DRDO's Nag missile systems, in line with its impetus on indigenization in accordance with its latest defense procurement policy, giving a push for Make in India in defense production. Let us have a brief look at what are Nag missile systems, as such questions are often asked in the prelims examination. Now, coming to Nag missile systems, Nag is basically a third generation anti-tank missile. Now, these anti-tank missiles are basically weapons that are created to destroy enemy tanks and armored vehicles of the enemy. Now, in the earlier days, these anti-tank weapons were basically rockets, mines or rifles, in which the soldiers in the infantry had to approach close to the target in order to fire these weapons. However, with the coming of missile technology, now the infantry soldiers are able to defeat these tanks and the armored vehicles of the enemy from a much longer range compared to what a rocket, a mine or a rifle could do. Now, Nag is one such advanced anti-tank weapon, which is a third generation anti-tank missile, which is basically guided by an infrared seeker, that is basically an electro-optical imager that identifies the target based on the temperature of the target using these infrared sensors. Now, the first generation or the second generation anti-tank missiles were basically guided by manual commands, and the missile had to be steered to the target. As a result, the soldier who used to operate these earlier generation missiles was exposed and vulnerable as he came in the line of sight of the target. As a result, these third generation missiles were conceived of with a fire and forget capability, where the target is sighted and the missile automatically aligns itself to the target based on the cues from the seeker, making it much safer for the soldier, who can basically retreat right after the firing is done, as there is no more guidance that is required as in case of the earlier versions. Now, this Nag third generation anti-tank missile was basically conceived of in the Integrated Guided Missile Development Program of 1982, under which research for 4 different missiles were conceived of, including Prithvi, which is a short-range surface-to-surface tactical ballistic missile, Trishul, a short-range low-level surface-to-air missile, Akash, which is also a surface-to-air missile, and Nag, which is, as mentioned earlier, a third-generation anti-tank missile. Now, coming to the operational requirements of anti-tank missile in the armed forces, the Indian Army alone requires about 68,000 anti-tank guided missiles, in line with its recent doctrinal shift of short wars with defined objectives that are basically fought for about 10 days, which in other words is called as 10I. India wants to go only for short wars with quick objectives which are predefined, in order to reduce the burden on the resources. Now, accordingly, as you must be aware, India also is operationalizing the integrated battle groups that are basically much smaller troops than a brigade. Accordingly, India has identified the requirement of about 68,000 anti-tank guided missiles required only for the Indian Army. Besides, the Nag missile systems are also used by the Indian Air Force, in that these missile systems are basically mounted on an aircraft, as we will see under the different variants of the Nag missile system. Now, as to features of the Nag missile system, as I have stated, it's a third generation anti-tank missile, meaning which the operator in the infantry can fire and forget, as it is guided by an infrared seeker, which basically guides the weapon by way of thermal imaging. Besides, the Nag missile systems come in three different variants. One is vehicle mounted, under which these Nag missiles are basically about 48 kilos, including the missile itself and the seeker, and are mounted on battle vehicles which are specially designed for the purpose, called as Namika. Now, Nag missile systems can also be mounted on an aircraft, that is Helena, which basically means helicopter launched Nag. Now, these airborne version of Nag missiles are launched from Rudra and Dhruv helicopters, and recently DRDO is also working on man-portable ATGM, which basically means that these anti-tank guided missiles are much lighter and therefore capable of being launched on a shoulder. Thus, three different variants of anti-tank missiles are basically one vehicle mounted, shoulder mounted, and aircraft mounted. Now, without getting into the tussle between DRDO and the Israeli firm, which may not be relevant from the perspective of the exam, let us do a quick recap of the names of some of the weapon systems that we have seen and their features which may be asked in the prelims exam. Nag, as we have seen, is a third generation anti-tank guided missile. It has an infrared seeker which provides it the capability of being operational under all weather conditions. It has a range of 3 to 7 kilometers. Being a third generation anti-tank guided missile, it also has fire and forget capability. Namika is basically a battle vehicle which has Nag missile mounted on it. Thus, it is called Nag missile carrier or Namika. Helena, helicopter launched Nag, which is used by the Indian Air Force. And Spike is the Israeli anti-tank guided missile that was basically competing with Nag missiles. With this, let's move to the next news. In what is seen as a U-turn yet again, the US president has hinted that the US Taliban talks are back on track. Now, you must be aware that recently the US President Donald Trump had called off the peace talks with Taliban after a suicide bombing had killed an American soldier. The US started accelerating efforts towards a peace process in Afghanistan when it started talking to Taliban in mid-2018. Now, after a round of negotiations, the two sides had almost come to a peace deal in August 2019 that primarily included withdrawal of majority of the troops of United States from Afghanistan. Now, in the aftermath of a suicide bombing that killed an American soldier, this peace deal was called off in September 2019. Now, in what is seen as a U-turn in his stand, the US president has yet again hinted that the US Taliban talks have resumed and are back on track. Now, in this context, we will analyze India's concerns in the situation of a resumed talks with Taliban. We will also analyze India's stand in Afghan's peace process and importance of Afghanistan for India in general. And therefore, this topic becomes important from the perspective of General Studies Paper 2 under International Relations. Now, it should be noted that India was among the first countries that had refused to recognize Taliban regime during the 96-2001 period when Taliban was ruling Afghanistan. Now, this was due to the fact that the Taliban's growth in Afghanistan was basically driven by the deep state in Pakistan. In that, Pakistan's policy of what is called as strategic depth led to Talibanization of the region, including Afghanistan. Now, in accordance with this strategic depth policy, Pakistan uses Afghanistan as an instrument of strategic security in the tensions with India by attempting to control Afghanistan as a pawn for its own political purpose. Now, in line with this strategic depth policy of Pakistan, the Taliban government had taken over the Afghanistan during 96, which was opposed by India. Now, accordingly, giving legitimacy to Taliban will further lead to radicalization of the region and hence is a deep concern for India. The Taliban leadership is in Pakistan and the deep state of Pakistan, including the army and the ISI,
will accelerate efforts to Talibanize the Gilgit-Baltistan region and the Mirpur-Muzaffarabad region, leading to further radicalization in the Jammu and Kashmir area. Besides, the Pakistan-based terrorist groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jamaat-ud-Dawa and Jaish-e-Mohammed will start filling up empty spaces in Afghanistan that may be left due to governance deficit in the region. Besides, India has undergone a number of development projects in Afghanistan which are continuously being threatened by Haqqani network, Al-Qaeda and Islamic State of Khorasan that has recently emerged in the FASTag region. As a result, India has always been against the institution of Taliban government in Afghanistan due to possible threat to regional security in the entire region and further radicalization within India. Now, however, in a significant departure to this policy of not engaging with Taliban, India for the first time in November 2018 in what is called as the Moscow format engaged with Taliban along with 11 other countries towards the Afghan peace process. Ever since, India's stand on Afghan peace process has been that the peace process shall be Afghan-led, Afghan-owned and Afghan-controlled, in that all the initiatives and the processes must include all sections of the Afghan society, including the elected government. Now, it should be noted that the U.S Taliban peace talks did not involve the elected government of Afghanistan, led by Ashraf Ghani, which was put forth as one of the conditions by Taliban to exclude the legitimate government in the peace talks. Now, besides, India being a regional leader wants establishment of a democratic process with respect for constitutional legacy and political mandate in Afghanistan. Besides, the peace process should not leave any ungoverned spaces in Afghanistan that can be filled up by terrorist networks like Haqqani network, Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, which will eventually pose a threat to regional security in the region. Now, coming to importance of Afghanistan in the region. Now, India's interest in Afghanistan basically lies in the fact that it needs to reduce Pakistani influence in the region, which is in the larger interest of regional security of the region, as we have seen here due to the strategic depth policy of Pakistan. Besides, Afghanistan is a gateway to Central Asian countries that is energy rich and thus is extremely important for India's energy security. Besides, Afghanistan is also home to a number of rare earth minerals which are extremely important for the domestic electronics companies in India. Now, as a result of this, the resuming of talks between US and Taliban, excluding the democratically elected government of Afghanistan, is a concern to India and is said to be isolated in the process, which is backed by all the major powers including US, Russia and China. Now, as a way forward, India should engage all sections of the Afghan society in order to push Taliban for a democratic process to be instituted in Afghanistan in the aftermath of US withdrawal. Besides, India can step up security in its own backyard as the threat from Taliban and the deep state in Pakistan is inevitable. Besides, India should also use its diplomatic leverage to persuade all the major powers to include all sections of Afghan society in the peace process in order to maintain peace in the region.
Now, this news appears on page number 1 and relates to FASTags, in that the central government has extended the deadline for mandatory migration to FASTags by 15 days to December 15th. Now, earlier, the deadline for mandatory FASTag migrations for all vehicles on the national highways was 1st December. Now, as a result of initial teething problems, the center has now extended the dates to 15th December as the deadline for mandatory migration of FASTags. In this context, we will look at what is FASTag, how does FASTags work, what are the benefits of migrating to FASTag, and what is the way forward for better implementation of FASTags in the country. Now, this topic becomes important from both prelims and mains perspective. Questions may be asked, especially based on the technology that is used behind FASTags. Now, FASTags are basically RFID based electronic toll collection system that is being implemented along the national highways across the country. Now, as to how these FASTags work, as I've already mentioned, FASTags are based on RFID devices. Now, this RFID tag or radio frequency identification tag is basically attached to the windscreen of the vehicle as seen in this figure. Now, this RFID tag that is attached to the windscreen of the vehicle is nothing but a transponder which contains customer data including credit card, debit card or other payment wallet details. Now, as and when the vehicle passes through the toll plaza as shown here, the antenna at the toll collection plaza beams a radio wave onto the transponder that is fitted to the vehicle. Now, the transponder on the vehicle, which is effectively an RFID tag, receives the signal from the antenna and sends back customer data in the form of a different radio frequency, which is then received by the antenna that is in turn connected to control stations which communicate with the banks for payment related information. Thus, a transponder which is attached on the windscreen, which effectively is an RFID tag, at the crossing of a toll plaza receives a signal that is beamed by the antenna, which in turn sends customer details in the form of another radio signal, which is again interpreted by the transceiver and sent to control stations which communicate with the banks for deduction of payments. Besides, these FASTags are valid for 5 years and also rechargeable as and when required. Now, the benefits of such an electronic toll collection system is that it enables continuous flow of traffic at the toll plazas and hence cuts the traffic congestions in the city. By eliminating the need for switching on and switching off of the engine, it reduces the loss of fuel while waiting at the toll plaza and hence curb vehicular pollution. Now, as a result of being an electronic toll collection system, it enhances the efficiency of toll collection in general, and it is estimated that India could save up to 12,000 crores a year in terms of fuel and man hours by using an electronic toll collection system at all the highways. Now, besides, as a way forward, the state highways also can be included under the FASTag scheme, in that a number of states including Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh and Haryana have already signed MOUs with the centre to implement FASTags in state highways. Now, recently, One Nation, One FASTag scheme has been launched, under which the National Highway Authority of India, which is the nodal agency for FASTag implementation, is trying to bring all the states on board to connect state highways to FASTag. Now, to sum up, FASTags are basically RFID based electronic toll collection system in which an RFID tag is attached on the windscreen of the vehicle, which when passes through a toll collection plaza comes in the line of sight of an antenna that is fitted on the toll collection stations, which then beams a radio wave which is received by the transponder, which sends in customer data in the form of a radio wave in another frequency. The antenna or the transceiver at the pole station then interprets this data that it receives from the transponder and sends it to the control stations, which then communicate with the banks or the payment gateways for deduction. Now, often such questions are asked on technologies in the prelims examination, and hence this topic becomes important more from prelims exam perspective. Now, let's move to the next topic. Now, this article appears on page number 1 in the context of the current visit of the Sri Lankan President Gotabaya Rajapaksa to India in response to the invitation that was extended by the External Affairs Minister in the aftermath of Rajapaksa's victory in the recent presidential election. Now, the key highlights of the visit is that India has extended a $50 million line of credit towards counter-terrorism activities. In addition, a $400 million line of credit for infrastructure development, particularly in north and east of Sri Lanka. Besides, the Sri Lankan president has also promised to take active measures towards release of fishermen on humanitarian grounds that have been detained on account of illegal fishing in the Sri Lankan waters. Now, in the context of External Affairs Minister Jaishankar's visit to Sri Lanka in the aftermath of the victory of Rajapaksas in the presidential election, we have covered the issue related to the current politics in Sri Lanka and its impact on India. So let us revise this aspect of dynamics of Sri Lankan politics with respect to India. Now, understanding the key actors in Sri Lankan politics with respect to India, now the Rajapaksas who have won the presidential elections have historically favored China, are hostile to minorities like Muslims and Tamils, and generally considered to be authoritarian in nature. On the other hand, the Sirisena Wickramasinghe coalition favor India, support the minorities, especially the Tamils in the north and east of Sri Lanka, and are also considered to be democratic in nature with respect to the democratic institutions provided by the Constitution. Thus, in this context, the urgency of Indian External Minister to visit Sri Lanka and engage with the Rajapakshas is on account of this Tamil factor in Indo-Sri Lankan relations that has been one of the major factor between the two countries. Now, Indo-Sri Lankan relations are historically dominated by the Tamil factor in that India has been pushing for greater devolution of power to Tamil minorities in north and east of Sri Lanka, which was pushed by India even in the Indo-Sri Lanka Peace Accord of 1987, which provided for a proposal for 13th Amendment through which greater devolution of powers in the north and east to Tamil minorities were to be given. However, as I have already mentioned, the Rajapaksa regime has historically seen this as an interference in the domestic matters and are generally hostile to the minorities in Sri Lanka. Thus, the new election results could delay the process of devolution of powers to Tamils and justifies India's urgency to meet the Rajapakshas to persuade them in the Tamil matter. So, in this backdrop, India, in line with its neighborhood first policy, has shown great urgency to engage with the new regime in Sri Lanka so as to expedite the process of full devolution of powers in the north and east region of Sri Lanka. Now, having understood the current dynamics in India-Sri Lanka relations, let us understand some key issues that guide the bilateral relationship between India and Sri Lanka. Now, coming to the strategic significance of Sri Lanka is a significant component of the Indo-Pacific strategy of the Quad group, including India, which is battling with China for a stronghold in the region, in which Sri Lanka becomes an important political theatre. Now, this is due to the fact that Sri Lanka forms the heart of a major maritime route from Malacca Strait to the Persian Gulf. Besides, in line with its recent impetus on maritime domain awareness, India has deployed a number of radars in Sri Lanka as a part of its coastal surveillance radar system. Now, coming to the Tamil issue has historically dominated the India-Sri Lanka relations, under which India has been pushing for greater devolution of powers to Tamil minorities in north and east. Accordingly, the 1987 Indo-Sri Lanka Accord provided for 13th Amendment through which Tamil was recognized as an official language in Sri Lanka and also provincial councils were set up. However, this process of devolution of power is still a work in progress, as complete devolution of powers has still not happened, in that the powers related to land, police and financial powers have not yet been devolved to the provincial councils in the north and east. Now, India has been pushing hard for complete devolution of powers, including the pending issues of land, finance and police in the north and east, as the Tamil issue has significant impact domestically for India. Now, coming to the fisherman issue, India and Sri Lanka shares a maritime border as shown in the figure here, with Indian Ocean in the south, Gulf of Mannar and Pak Bay in the middle, and the Bay of Bengal in the north. Now, the major area of contention between the two countries is the fishing in the fluid boundaries in the Pak Bay and the Gulf of Mannar region, where the Indian fishermen, as a result of weakening stock in the Indian side, have often transgressed the maritime boundary, especially near the Kachativu island, as you can see in the map, leading to a number of detentions from the Sri Lankan Navy in the last 2 decades. Now, India has been suggesting to treat the issue in a humane manner, and it's a welcome step that the new president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, has promised to resolve the issue in the near future. Now, while these issues form the key highlights in the Indo-Sri Lanka relations, a comprehensive analysis of Indo-Sri Lanka relations was done in the backdrop of the results of presidential elections on 18th November 2019. So, I suggest you go through the DNS analysis of 18th November 2019 for a complete understanding of the bilateral issues between India and Sri Lanka. Now, with this, next move to the next topic. Now, this news appears on page number 1 in the context of Indian economy witnessing the lowest growth in the last 25 quarters, in that the GDP has declined to about 4.5%, which is lowest since 2012. Now, this topic becomes important from the perspective of General Studies Paper 3 under Economic Development, and also from prelims perspective in terms of definitions related to the topic. Now, the latest GDP data for the last quarter from July to September shows that GDP has further declined to 4.5%, which is lowest since last 25 quarters beginning 2012. Now, a look at the sectoral growth indicates that while the agriculture sector and service sector have witnessed a slowdown in the growth, the manufacturing sector has witnessed a contraction in that the growth has declined by 1% compared to a 6.9% growth in the same quarter in the previous year. The slowdown in agriculture is shown by a 2.1% growth compared to 4.9% in the second quarter in the last year, and service sector grew by 2.1% in the first half of this year compared to 5% in the first half of last year. Now, the decline in GDP is on account of two factors, mainly low demand and low investment. The low demand is reflected in slowdown in the private final consumption expenditure, which has slowed down to about 5.06% compared to 9.7% in the last year. And the low investments are reflected in the low gross fixed capital formation, which grew only at 1.02% compared to 11.8% last year. Now, besides, it is important to note that when we refer to the term growth in India, it generally means GDP at factor cost at constant prices. Now, the constant prices means GDP is factored for inflation and reflects what is known as real GDP, which is reflected in the blue curve in this graph. Now, with this, let's take up the practice questions. Now, this question is based on the news that appears on page number 15, which says core sector contracts mainly on account of contraction in electricity and coal sector. Now, as to the definition of core sectors can be defined as those key industries which are the backbone of all other industries in an economy. Now, accordingly, such questions as to what constitutes the core sectors are often asked in the prelims paper. So, this question reads, which of the following are among the 8 core industries in India? Now, cement is a part of core industries, hence this is true. Fertilizers is a part of core industries. This is also true. Natural gas and refinery products are also part of core industries. However, textile is not a part of core industries, and therefore the right answer is C, 1, 2, 3 and 4 only. Now, as to what constitutes 8 core sectors, I have given the list here. You may go through it. Now, the second question relates to the fiscal deficit slippage that has happened in India, in which it has crossed the 100% mark, and this news appears on page number 15. A related question regarding fiscal deficit, consider the following statements. An increase in fiscal deficit indicates government is resorting to borrowings to meet its day-to-day expenses. 2. Fiscal deficit reflects the amount of borrowings that government needs to resort to. Now, as to definition of fiscal deficit basically indicates the total expenditure minus total revenue. Thus, fiscal deficit is an indicator of market borrowings of the government, and hence statement 2 is correct. Besides, the first option says an increase in fiscal deficit indicates government is resorting to borrowings to meet its day-to-day expenses. Now, as per the definition, fiscal deficit means total expenditure minus total revenue, which includes both capital and revenue expenditure, and therefore the government may resort to borrowings not only for day-to-day expenditure but also for capital expenses, and hence this option is wrong. Therefore, the answer is A, 1 only. With this, we come to the end of today's discussion. Now let's take up the question for the day.